Welcome to our panel on the Gulf, picking up on a theme that has been very prominent since yesterday in our various panels. The Gulf, whether as a source of threats and challenges, or maybe also as a hub of transformation and new directions, has been at the heart of much of our discussion over the 2 days of our annual conference. And today I'm joined by colleagues Yasmin Farouk and Christian Ulrichsen and Jane Kinnamont from various capitals around the world, experts on the Gulf, whether on Iran, on GCC states, on Yemen, and geopolitics in particular, to tackle a number of themes. We're going to focus now very specifically on aspects of the foreign policy of GCC countries, the relations with Iran and where that'll take them. We're going to zoom in on the special case of Yemen and then zoom deeper still into the GCC transformations internally as the financial future of the Gulf becomes more and more in question. And I'm going to start with the relationship with Iran, or tensions with Iran. Indirect talks between Washington and Tehran resumed today in Vienna after having broken off last week, partly as a result of Western officials expressing dismay over Iran's demands. But on the other hand, we have the Emirati National Security Advisor, Sheikh Tahmoud bin Zayed Al Nahyan, visiting Tehran, meeting his Iranian counterparts as part of what senior diplomatic advisor to the UAE President Anwar Gharash described last month as steps to de-escalate tensions as part of a policy choice towards diplomacy and away from confrontation. So there's something happening there. And I turn now to the panelists to ask whether signs of a thaw and of de-escalation are actually likely to survive and shape the trajectory, or do you think this is going to fail and we'll be looking at confrontation once again? And I'm going to, over the next hour, let people jump in pretty much as and when they want. But I'll go first to Yasmin, and then I'll move to the other two panelists.
Thank you, Aziz, and thank you very much for inviting me today, and I'm happy to share the panel with my two distinguished colleagues. There is definitely a willingness and a choice in the capitals of the Arab Gulf countries today to try to de-escalate tension, and for two reasons that are usually presented when the question is asked. The first one of them is a feeling that they are left to their own capacities, their own, very specifically, defense capacities vis-a-vis Iran, and that there is a realization for some of the less experienced leaders among them, but there is an understanding from the more experienced among them that they cannot balance Iran's power, and they cannot defend themselves against Iran's attacks, even if they are kinetic, or even if they are similar to the attacks that we have seen under the Trump administration so far. The second thing is that if you take a country like Saudi Arabia, there is a focus on making Vision 2030 a success, on making it happen. And there is a realization that this cannot take place if attacks from Yemen continue, if there are other attacks from Iran. And these are two main drivers, in addition to others, of why today there is a clear policy choice of de-escalation. Now, the problem has always been in the relationship with Iran is that when taken bilaterally, or even Gulf countries, the six of them vis-a-vis Iran, there is an imbalance of power. There is always a need of international support to put pressure on Iran to make what the Iranians see as concessions to Gulf countries. And even though the United States, also France and other powers negotiating the GCPOA, that is actually negotiations that are actually stalling and turned out to be more difficult than expected. Even though there's a lot of talk and a lot of promises that Iran's regional activities are going to be taken into consideration when negotiating with Iran, there is no concrete mechanism for how this is going to be done. Gulf countries cannot have come to realize that they are coordinating with the international parties negotiating with Iran on the nuclear level, but that on the regional level, they need to take things into their own hands. It is not easy. And as I said, there is an imbalance of power, but they are at least doing it for the time being. And this is why I think that as long as they can, this de-escalation path is going to continue. But of course, not forever. So far, we haven't seen any concrete results on the ground. But what I keep hearing and what I keep reading is that there is a realization that this is a better path than the path of confrontation or supporting maximum pressure or even exercising maximum pressure on Iran.
So I'm going to move to Christian and Jane immediately, but I was very struck by two things you said, one of which is you started out by emphasizing that despite any attempt to develop indigenous capabilities, external relationships and protection are still very important, if I understood you correctly. But second, also, you referred to bilateral interactions, and it's striking that we're not really talking about a collective GCC approach for dealing with Iran, which, of course, I understand you drew the conclusion that there's still a missing architecture for regional engagement with Iran within the GCC states, which strikes me as a bit of a problem. And I wonder whether there's scope for divergence among individual GCC states over time, or whether they'll manage to keep more or less going in this similar direction. I'll move to Christian maybe first, and then come after that to Jane, because I'd like to see whether you agree with what we've heard so far, or have
I'd also like to respond to those 2 points whenever.
Very well. Okay. Christian.
Oh, thank you. Yes. Well, I agree very much with what Yasmin just said about the reasons why Gulf countries individually, not necessarily collectively, are trying to come to their own arrangements. And this isn't, of course, anything new. We've seen the beginnings of the shift in approach dating back to 2019. And that was also the conclusions that the Saudis and UAE especially drew from the pattern of attacks on shipping and energy targets between May and September 2019 that culminated in the attack on Saudi oil facilities in September 2019 at Abqaiq. And very much a realization, I think, that from Gulf leaders, that they are on the front line in any escalation between Iran and the US, or Iran and the international community, and that the policy of maximum pressure, which the Trump administration had launched initially with the support of the Saudis and the UAE, had actually left them much more vulnerable, and the attacks underscored their vulnerability to Iranian or Iranian-linked retaliation. And the decision by the Trump administration not to respond, at least overtly, and to actually draw a distinction after the Abqaiq attack, when Trump himself said this was an attack on Saudi Arabia, it wasn't an attack on the US. I think that struck a shiver into the heart of leaders in the Gulf, who I think had always assumed until that point that, particularly when it came to Iran, their interests and US interests were largely one and the same. And this was now called into question. So we have seen individual leaders making decisions to take a different path. As you said, Yazid, we haven't really seen a collective approach as yet. The GCC has always struggled to take collective positions on foreign security and defense policies in any case, going back decades. This reflects the fact that we're talking about 6 individual monarchies with different interests of their own, and also different historical patterns of interaction with Iran as well. And so I think the fact that the Saudis and the Emiratis have their own distinctive lines of engagement with Iran, which are separate but are still geared toward de-escalation, is at least a first step. And I think also a recognition that perhaps leaders in the Gulf don't have full confidence in the US administration's ability to re-enter the JCPOA and also a follow-on agreement, which the Biden administration had been talking about at the beginning of its time in office. I think there's a realization that not only is the JCPOA proving very difficult for the US to re-engage with, but the chances of a further agreement that would address issues of relevance to the Gulf leaders, such as Iran's regional activities, are probably very slim. So hence we're seeing leaders in the Gulf taking things into their own hands, not waiting around for the negotiations to produce a result. They're actually just trying to kind of do their own initiatives instead. And I suspect that's what we're going to see continuing, because, as Yasmin said, especially in a time of economic difficulties after the last couple of years with the pandemic, the priority is now on economic growth, and geopolitical risk and uncertainty is not something that Gulf leaders will want to have to take into account.
I want to come back to you and Yasmin and Jane as well on specifically whether there's any significant difference in perception in the Gulf now that we're talking about the Biden administration and not the Trump administration, and to what extent the dismay that was felt when Trump said, well, this is an attack on Saudi Arabia, not on the USA, in reference to the attacks, whether that perception is going to shift again or be rolled back, and whether, say, a Republican return in 3 years to the presidency would or restore Gulf confidence, or whether the Gulf now feels that US policy is too dependent on these sort of cyclical changes every 4 years to be too dependent on it. Jane, I see you nodding there, and you might want to come in on this as well if you like, but also please do go back to what you wanted to say anyway.
Absolutely. So I think it's important, as Christian said, that these contacts between UAE and Saudi and Iran started a couple of years ago under Trump. And of course, with Qatar, they've been going for longer. Qatar has needed Iran more since the Gulf blockade. And Kuwait and Oman have basically always had those contacts. So work has been done. However, the kind of contacts that we see, they are very much between intelligence services, and they're heavily focused on security. And Yemen has been one of the main areas of focus where, understandably, the Saudis and Iranians have felt, this is a priority, and this is an area where we might be able to have common ground, vital to Saudi Arabia as it's next door and directly relates to its security, and something that Iran is probably more willing to compromise on than its policies in the Levant. But there would need to be much more to buttress some kind of sustainable cooperation between Iran and the Gulf countries. So something I'd really like to flag, especially for policymakers who may be watching this, is it's really worth paying attention to what has been coming out of the Track 2 efforts that have been going on for years. Even when Saudi-Iran talks were completely suspended, there are scholars from the region, from think tanks and universities, who have been trying to find ways forward. Often they stay away from the security issues to some extent. They don't want to get in trouble with their governments, but they're often debating the scope for economic cooperation. How could you build networks of young entrepreneurs? Where could there be technology sharing, from green energy to telecoms and IT, that might actually create longer term incentives for these countries to work together? So I think that's really important. In terms of the US, I think the transition to Biden has sped all this up. I think that the Gulf states have been increasingly keen to show that they are diplomatic forces rather than aggressive and difficult allies. But it's other things too. It's also COVID. There isn't as much money from oil to throw around these days. It's some countries, perhaps especially the UAE, have realized that they were a bit overstretched. And just to slightly counter the perception that there was no response to Abqaiq, some US officials would say, yes, there was a response. It was the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. And when that happened, the Gulf countries really wanted to distance themselves from that. They did not want to see as being involved. So I do think that, towards the second half of the Trump administration, there was a fear from the Gulf countries that it was all going too far, and that rather than bringing Iran to the table ready to compromise, there was a real risk of war, which none of the countries in the region want.
Thanks, Jane. That actually brings me wonderfully to a question we've had from the audience, which I want to address to all three of you. And it's, I think, a great way of wrapping up this first part of our discussion. And that is, is there anything that looks like a win-win situation for all three key blocs here, Iran, the USA, and the GCC? And what you just said, Jane, was, really interesting, because you remind us that there were people in the US who would say, well, no, actually, there was a response from the US to the Iranian or Iranian-backed attack, and that the GCC got rather nervous about this. So we've got, Iran with its hardliners, the US with its hardliners, whatever we want to call them, and the GCC, which is somewhere in the middle, and maybe potentially it looks like, the party that is best positioned to lead something in between that's not too extreme on either side. So is this a situation where there could be a win-win outcome for all three? Or is it just too vulnerable and subject to, what the hardliners on either side, the Iranian or the US side, might do in this case? And are there hardliners within the GCC who might actually throw their weight either way? So I'll come to you, Jane, first, and go in reverse order to Christian and then Yasmin.
Thank you. I mean, I think in theory, there is quite a clear win-win. The more you think about future relationships being geared towards economic development, technological progress, human thriving, really making the Middle East benefit from its potential as a trading hub that in many ways is at the center of the world. It's easy to imagine, and there's so much in common between Iran and the GCC states in terms of their young populations striving for the post-hydrocarbon future that is the subject of this panel. But I think very few people, especially in leadership positions, believe in it. And as so often in conflict situation, the view is always, well, the other side only believe in zero-sum outcomes, and therefore that is what we have to take forward. I think, it is going to be very difficult to find accommodations across the suite of regional conflicts, but any attempts to do it should very much try to focus on, addressing the different conflicts in the region from a point of view of self-determination of those peoples, and not fall into the trap of thinking that the region could be carved up into Iranian or Saudi spheres of influence.
Thanks. Christian.
Yes, thank you. Just very briefly, interestingly enough, I think the killing of Qasem Soleimani was a response to the death of an American contractor in Baghdad, which actually, I think, underscored Gulf leaders' views that the Trump administration was willing to respond when US interests were hit, not when their partners' interests were hit. They did nothing after Abqaiq, but they did after the attack in Baghdad in December 2019, which, again, I think reinforced the leaders' skepticism. But very much in terms of what could reframe the relationship, as Jane mentioned, energy and economic challenges are very much similar in terms of what happens over the next decade in the Gulf and Iran, the need to get economic development back on track, to diversify economic growth, to develop, as Jane mentioned, technologies around renewable energy. And these are issues which they all share. And so these are areas where there could be cooperation, there should be cooperation. And I think we're already seeing the beginning of that with the UAE and Iran too. And so if, again, we can find a way of reframing Gulf-Iran dynamics away from political and security issues, which have been dominated by a focus on confrontation, to a focus on what are the common areas of economic and sort of development and challenges they face, then that is something that is positive and should be, well, is likely to produce better results.
And take the chance to add the other comments you wanted to earlier.
Just add to, well, I'll start where Christian ended on the elements that could lead, or the main factors that could lead to win-win-win situation. Definitely the economics and the energy, as he highlighted, but also I'd like to draw attention to the conference that took place in Baghdad, Iraq. Iraq is a place where actually different parties have common interests. First of them is actually the combat against the resurgence of Daesh, which is something that neither Iran nor the United States nor Gulf countries want. This, in addition to energy, in addition to the fact that there is a new element that was added in favor of the Gulf countries' negotiating power vis-a-vis Iran, which is Israel. The main fact that today a presence or a security cooperation with Israel is actually becoming a card of negotiation with Iran. Iran clearly doesn't want Israel involved in the security of the Gulf, give actually Gulf countries leverage in the negotiation. So I think there are elements that could lead to compromise, that could lead to a win-win-win, meaning a more stability in the Gulf, because this is the end game for everybody. To go back to the other points that you mentioned, and very quickly, I will have just two comments. Your first comment about the Gulf countries continuing to seek external protection. Well, I am very sad to say yes. It remains that in every encounter with the United States or in every public event, you hear Gulf officials saying, well, the United States are disengaging from the region, and it is a true concern. And even when mentioning the relationship with Russia and China, those relations are mentioned, as being, well, if you don't help us, we have to seek help from elsewhere. The building indigenous capabilities is there. It is there in the Gulf discourse narratives. It is there in Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia, for example. But there is always a limit in building the indigenous capacity, which is, I know very well, Nazi, the governance inside those countries. Those countries those regimes do not necessarily want very robust and very capable armies and militaries that become centers of powers. So they would like new arms. They can create special forces that are very capable, like the case of the UAE, for example. But the question remains, are they willing to give their armies the training and the education needed in order to build a national capacity that would support them and make them less reliant on external protection vis-a-vis Iran? I think that's a real question. Your point about the collective GCC, I think the tour that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is doing right now in the Gulf countries is part of this attempt of coordinating positions on Iran. I think there was a statement in November in Riyadh with the United States and then with the E3 about trying to forge a collective position vis-a-vis Iran. But again, as my colleagues have mentioned, there are differences between Gulf countries. There are differences between Gulf countries and the United States. So I see the attempts there of building a collective position, but it remains to be seen. It is definitely, I think, not an option for Saudi Arabia to involve, other all Gulf countries in its bilateral negotiations with Iran, at least not at this stage, even if the Saudis do want to appear to have the support of other Gulf countries. But when push comes to shove, are these other Gulf countries willing to put pressure or to use their relationship with Iran in order to get immediate gains for Saudi Arabia? That's a question. And one last very brief comment about the Biden versus Trump administration. As Jane mentioned, it is not a coincidence that a lot of those de-escalation talks began, by the end of the Trump administration. And when the Biden administration came, we have seen them, being more active, let's say. The US will continue to play a role even when it doesn't want to. The mere feeling of a less US military interest in the region will continue to push those Gulf countries to find their own ways to deal with their conflicts and to deal with the instability and insecurity that is surrounding them.
Well, thanks again, Yasmin. Thanks to all three of you. I'm going to pick a number of threads from the discussion we've had so far and move to the focus on foreign policy and foreign policy activism of GCC states more generally, shifting away from Iran, however, and to look at the sort of new forms of activism. So, we've had the muscular activism with a lot of projection of military power, and pursuit also of strategic infrastructure like ports in the Red Sea and Horn of Africa and in Yemen, as well as gas and oil pipelines and so on. But now we see a new phase that, as we've heard, seems to de-emphasize some of this to seek de-escalation with Iran. But I see this as part of a broader approach that shifts. At the same time, there's still a lot of GCC activism. Again, a lot of this is Saudi and Emirati, whether in Lebanon or by not being involved in Lebanon, whether normalization with Israel or normalization with the Damascus government, the regime of President Bashar al-Assad, but also more discreet involvement in Sudan following the military coup of October 25. Of course, a deep involvement with Egypt, continuing involvement in Libya, and potentially, possibly also in Tunisia since the transformations that have happened since last July. So there's still a lot of foreign policy activism. And here I want to weave in some of the questions, very interesting ones we're getting from the audience. So I want sort of your assessment of what the drivers and maybe limits are of this newfound activism. Oman is a good case where it's been more active, but specifically in relation to Iran and to Yemen. But that might not extend beyond that as far as Oman goes. But of course, the Saudis and Emiratis have much broader horizons. But also because a lot of this is presented as sort of geopolitical risk, but there's also maybe geopolitical opportunity represented in this case, as I think all three of you have emphasized, by the continuing importance of the Gulf as a source of investment and assistance and so on, internally, but also in countries around them. So will we maybe see a greater emphasis on economic and financial investments and development assistance and others as part of foreign policy activism? So I'm giving you a whole cluster of issues, and who wants to jump in first? Press your unmute button and I'll give you the floor. Jane.
I feel like it's a game show, first to press the buzzer. Fabulous questions. I believe that the foreign policy activism is something that is now baked in by structural changes. Doesn't mean that they'll always be as active as they've been in the last few years with their perception that the region is in chaos. But, traditionally, all the Gulf states except Saudi Arabia outsource their foreign policy to the UK. And for some time, they largely, in many ways, followed the US. And now their interests have diverged in a number of ways. Firstly, they've really taken on global economic interests. They're investing everywhere from Africa to Latin America to the Arctic. And that means that there's a foreign policy interest where the investments have gone. Secondly, their security has to be more diversified. Still, no one can replace the US, but other countries are needed to complement and supplement the US. And as has been mentioned, that's one of the drivers of the Abraham Accords. It's very notable that the Gulf states have also been hedging their bets by getting closer to Russia as well as China. And with Russia, it is very much driven by security, the need to have more friends. And I think they'll all be watching closely the fact that, not only is this part of the world where Kuwait has had the experience of being invaded and occupied and facing an existential threat, but as they look around the world now, they see Ukraine at risk of a possible invasion. They see chatter every day about the chances of Taiwan being invaded and very real questions about how the international system will actually respond if those things happen. One of the messages that sends you is you don't want any of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council to be against you, because that would prevent international action in such a kind of extreme situation. So they want to make sure they're diversifying their friends, and they've got a number of insurance policies if their sovereignty is threatened. But the last factor that has really made them active in the region is the fear of democracy. Even if for them that's linked in their minds of the governments to extremism, the Muslim Brotherhood, etc., they have got deeply involved in quite a number of countries to suppress democracy. And that has also made them quite a number of enemies. And I think there's a big question for the US and Western governments if they really want to keep going ahead with the idea that the West competes against China as supporters of democracy. It is an Achilles heel if some of your best friends and closest economic partners are actively subverting democracy in other parts of the world.
Thanks so much. Yasmin, I'll come to you. Change the sequencing.
I totally agree with Jane on the last point. Definitely, the fear of democracy will make those countries continue to intervene and be activist whenever needed, especially in cases where the potential of spillover into their own spaces, into their own countries, is high. I also agree with her when she says that, or at least I will add to her point about the structural reasons. As long as the structural reasons that made those countries become more activist in foreign policy and more interventionist in the way that they have been are there, I think the activist foreign policy is going to continue. But maybe, as you mentioned, Yazid, not in the hawkish way that we have seen before, not necessarily like the UAE did by intervening actually or supporting militarily in conflicts such as Libya and Yemen. I don't think that Saudi Arabia is going to repeat the Yemeni experience anytime soon. So we will see this because of the structural reasons that push them to intervene might continue, meaning the threats to the security of the regimes might continue. They will continue, but maybe they will use different approaches. Another structural reason that is the absence of other centers of powers or other big countries that could play this role of intervention. And you know, the traditional thinking is always to think about Egypt, that has been consumed very much by its own domestic problems, but now also regional when it comes to GERD, when it comes to Libya, when it comes to Sudan. So those structural reasons make it create a regional order or disorder that makes them continue their activist foreign policy. The last factor that I would add is actually activism by invitation. You know, I was following very closely how many world leaders talked to the Saudis and the Emiratis about Sudan, about Tunisia. So as long as they are receiving those invitations to intervene about Lebanon right now, their role is actually needed. The issue is, can you make this role as constructive as possible? From their own point of view, from the point of view of considering the needs of the countries where they are intervening, or not?
Several things I'm going to want to follow up on that, but I want to come to Christian first, please.
Yes, thank you. Well, I would just make maybe a final point that a number of things came together in 2020 to bookend a decade that began with the Arab uprisings in 2011 and was really characterized by geopolitical confrontation, not only within the Gulf, but also across the wider region with, as you say, Saudi Arabia, UAE often supporting movements and organizations that were ranged against perceived support from Qatar or from Turkey. And then we also saw Turkey getting drawn into the geopolitical confrontation. And in 2020, we had, of course, the pandemic. We had the ending of the Trump administration, at least for its first iteration, if something may come back. But at least the ending of the kind of era of raw power politics being acceptable again, although, as Jane mentioned, we could easily see that Taiwan and Ukraine may show that era is still a risk. But from a leader's point of view in the Gulf, that decade of confrontation didn't really produce any winners. It produced a lot of economic, it produced a lot of indications that there are limits to the deployment of hard military and security power. The UAE has found out at its cost in Yemen and in Libya. It cannot necessarily project hard power on a wider scale as it perhaps thought it had. And of course, the Saudi involvement in Yemen has been a military and operational setback that wasn't perhaps foreseen in 2015. So we've seen the limitations of that decade of confrontation. We also saw the Gulf rift with Qatar ending very much in a well, no clear winners. I mean, there were obviously the Qataris were winners in the sense that they didn't capitulate, but the ability of all the states to sort of forge their own paths was, I think, curtailed. So we have seen that limitation, and I think we will see now, post-pandemic, if and when that period comes, that especially in an era now of climate action, of greater international focus perhaps on energy transitions, that there is a need to refocus policy priorities, to try and stay ahead of the next set of changes which may be coming. And those are not necessarily geopolitical, they're perhaps more economic and energy focused.
I'm glad you ended on that, because I think that's something we're going to have to come back to when we come to the final section of discussion about sort of socioeconomic and financial future in the Gulf and its implications for things like energy and adaptation and so business reforms, economic reforms, youth unemployment, etc. I want to weave in a couple of questions we've had from the audience to come back to you for a sort of quick round, still on the foreign policy issue. I mean, I think it's very interesting to see what trends you feel are long-term. Also, you seem to be suggesting, not to assume that the Gulf now is dispensing with the US on the one side, but neither should the West not actually seek actively to involve Gulf countries in some of these other foreign policy challenges around the region. This is very interesting. Let me pick up on just a couple of points that maybe we could say a little bit more about. Christian, you just mentioned the Qatar feud with the Emirates and Saudi Arabia that has been resolved, but it still seems a bit ambiguous. Of course, we've heard a lot more about trade and investment competition between the UAE and Saudi Arabia over the past 6 months or so. Are we looking at a sort of more of an Emirati-Saudi rivalry? I wouldn't call it a feud, but a rivalry that sort of leaves the Qatar issue behind. It's no longer forefront. We have sort of the Turkish involvement in all this, plus a thawing of relations with several GCC countries and Turkey, and of course normalization with Israel. And maybe a question, is it still a question of whether Saudi Arabia will follow suit and normalize, or is that too finely balanced? So I'd like to come to each of you to maybe touch on that, but try and stay sort of within a minute or so, because I really want us to have enough time to discuss Yemen, but also finally the sort of more domestic transformations. Jane, why don't I come to you again?
I think there have been indications that the kind of intense Saudi UAE honeymoon that came after the rise of Mohammed bin Salman may have cooled off, but to a large extent, that is just a reversion to norms, that there are always frictions between Gulf countries. They do deal with a lot of their other friends bilaterally, and that can create competition. And it's easy for small personal differences to be magnified in these massively personalized systems. But I think they'll still manage broadly to work together, when they see a strong need to do so. I think it's, there are just differences between Saudi and the UAE structurally. I think it's more difficult for Saudi Arabia to normalize, especially at this point, if it's just kind of joining a bandwagon without getting any big win in return. The UAE was enabled to make that move partly because Netanyahu said that he was going to freeze his annexation plans, and that suited him domestically, but it allowed the UAE to present itself as getting a gain for the Palestinians, even though really it was just preventing things from getting much worse for them. Right now, the Israeli government has a majority of one in the parliament. It's extremely fragile. It's making it pretty clear that it is not going to move on peace. So something would need to be worked out for Saudi Arabia to be able to join, given its standing in the broader Islamic world, without seeming to have some kind of benefit that could actually push forward peace rather than bilateral cooperation between countries that have never been at war.
Thanks. Yasmin?
On the rivalry with the UAE, as again, I will agree with Jane. We have there was really a tendency to forget the history of, inter-Gulf relations. I think that part of what might be, or what I hope to be, a learning curve, in Riyadh for the new leadership, and here I mean the Crown Prince, is that Saudi Arabia is not the UAE, and Saudi Arabia cannot necessarily afford to align itself on the UAE. The interests that are defined in Abu Dhabi are not the same interests that are of Riyadh. And this is why I don't think that this is going to be like an exceptional competition or rivalry. There are definitely heightened economic interests and huge development plans in Saudi Arabia that will take the competition with the UAE to a new level. But on the security, on the political level, the history of the two countries had witnessed those kinds of rivalry, competition, and even conflict before. And we have here the Christian, who is a reference on intra-Gulf relations, who can talk to us about this. Is the Qatar problem behind? It depends on what you mean by problem. Qatar, since 1996, has chosen to have a more independent and autonomous foreign policy from Saudi Arabia, from the one of Saudi Arabia, and not just Saudi Arabia, by the way, from the one of Egypt and the other traditional major players that don't like to see small countries in the Arab world take a leading role that diverges with theirs. And I don't think that this Qatari foreign policy tendency will disappear. We do see, again, a willingness to find more areas of compromise rather than confrontation. But I don't think that Qatar will suddenly make the choice to align itself completely on the policies of Saudi Arabia or even the UAE, or even less, actually, the UAE. Finally, on the issue of the normalization with Israel, I do agree that, Saudi Arabia's calculations are very different from other Gulf countries, and I do believe that there is this realization in Riyadh. But I also have noticed that even though the kind of public pressure that existed under the Trump administration doesn't exist right now, but improving Saudi Arabia's image and actually giving Mohammed bin Salman access to the White House and access to the Biden administration is an incentive for the normalization with Israel. Now, I agree with Jane that maybe this is not enough by itself, because Saudi Arabia does need Israel to make a move on the Israeli-Palestinian issue in order not to lose the soft power it has in the Islamic world, or at least what's left of it. But I see it as still an item on the agenda, especially given that the relationship between Riyadh and the White House are tense right now. And actually, these tensions have an impact on, working together when it comes to Yemen, but also to Iran and other files in the bilateral, but also regional relations. And in the oil market, of course.
Thanks. Christian?
Yes, I would. Had we been having this discussion in 2010, I would have predicted that the Saudi-UAE rivalry would be the one that would define intra-Gulf politics for the next few years. We remember the 2009 spat over the GCC single currency, for example, when the UAE pulled out. What changed was, of course, the Saudis and Emiratis kind of having a common threat perception after 2011, and then Mohammed bin Zayed identifying Mohammed bin Salman as a kindred spirit and someone he could work with in 2015. I think that period is coming to an end. And as Yasmin said, as we get further into this decade, as 2030 draws closer, as Mohammed bin Salman perhaps feels more pressure that he has to deliver tangible economic and investment wins that would be consistent with his promise to deliver meaningful change by 2030, which is, of course, the date that he has really sort of set himself by, then we could see this confrontation economically, at least, becoming more visible. We've already seen signs of that. The UAE-Saudi issue, I think, is mostly economic. It's not necessarily political or ideological, so I don't necessarily see it becoming a similar issue with, say, the Qatar dispute, which was more about the future of political orientation and foreign policy orientation. Just briefly on Qatar, again, I would say that the agreement, the Al-Ula agreement, we're almost a year into it, that at least has been more durable, in part because I think it has been split up into separate tracks where the Qataris are now working with individual bilateral partners to address issues of specific concern. That may or may not be more durable, we don't know, but at least it's a different approach from 2014, from the Riyadh agreement of 2014, which was really a take it and leave it affair. People just put it on the shelf and just moved on, and that didn't prevent a new escalation 3 years later. At least now, it seems to be more of a structured approach to breaking down the sets of issues and dealing with them on a case-by-case basis. So I guess only time will tell if that's more of an approach that produces tangible outcomes.
Thanks so much. I mean, there's so much more I'd love to dive deeper into, but we are getting somewhat tight for time. And so I'm going to move us to Yemen. I'm going to sort of consolidate all the questions I prepared into one, basically, which is where you see this going. I mean, any scope for diplomacy, or is it just war, war, war? And if it's war, then do you see basically a Houthi win, since they seem to be the most capable actor on the ground to a large degree, at least the one that can operate on many fronts around the country, not just maybe on one particular part of it. And what does this tell us ultimately about, the outside powers? I mean, remember a decade ago, we had the GCC brokered deal that saw Ali Abdullah Saleh step down from the presidency. And now we're not really looking at the GCC coming in and maybe demonstrating once again its ability to act as a regional organization, resolving things within its own immediate neighborhood. Or could some sort of outcome emerge in Yemen that could, give us better hope for GCC revival? Or do we see cantons that Yemen will settle into some sort of informal cantonization with Iranian influence in some areas and other Saudi or Emirati influence elsewhere? So try and sort of pick on whatever you see as the most salient point you can add to this, rather than try and address the whole thing, because I do want to move us on to, as I said earlier, the sort of socioeconomic political transformations within the GCC as soon as we finish with Yemen. Over to you, Christian. I'm going to come back straight to you this time.
Well, I think what happens next in Yemen will be conditioned by whether or not the Saudis feel that they can withdraw in a manner that is not perceived as a military, operational, and political defeat. How and whether they can coexist with the Houthi on their southern border, which is a geographical fact that they can't wish away. The Saudi, US, Iran component obviously brings in external actors. We will probably find out the degree to which Iran has or has not, does or does not have leverage over the Houthis, the degree to which the Houthis have now become such an entrenched local actor with their own sets of interests that may or may not diverge from what Iran may or may not want, especially any Iranian-Saudi dialogue on how to sort of move forward in Yemen. So these are all issues which will come to the fore, and also the degree to which the US and other international actors can play a role in reassuring and perhaps providing support to the Saudis to ensure that they feel that they can disengage from Yemen and leave a Yemen that at least is functioning to a degree that is consistent with Saudi security and defense interests. And so these are all open questions, and I think we'll not know the answers until maybe after the fact.
So open questions, Yasmin. I mean, do you what can you add to this? Do you agree or see something missing? You're on mute. You need to unmute. Sorry.
No worries. I will. I definitely agree with Christian. I mean, over the past 2 days, we have been actually seeing an intensification of the military attacks and responses between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis, and these attacks have been escalating actually during the negotiations between the Saudis and Iranians, where Yemen is the main subject. I mean, if they don't agree on Yemen to Saudi Arabia, that's the priority, and that's the prelude to an agreement on any other file. I will honestly, I not that I'm trying to be optimistic. So I would like to wait and see what is going to come out of the current MBS tour in the Gulf countries and the summit that is coming in Riyadh, especially on Yemen, but also on Iran. I'm not saying that the differences will disappear, but it is an attempt again after a realization in Riyadh that unlike before, Saudi Arabia is no longer able to solve its Yemen issue on its own. It needs external support. And I would like to highlight something. I think that getting Saudi Arabia out of Yemen will not solve the problem, neither for Saudi Arabia nor for the international community. Right? Saudi Arabia not only needs to coexist with the Houthi on its borders, but it needs the security of its borders. It needs a guarantee, some sort of arrangement that will make the Houthis stop the attacks. We are now talking about attacks that went from the first years of the war of being limited to the south to attacks that reach Riyadh, that reach Jeddah. And, this is a huge issue for the Saudi, and leaving Yemen without finding an arrangement is not something that is viable for the Saudis. That being said, I think one of the areas where the support is missing is actually bringing back the Yemeni conflict to Yemenis, meaning that at the same time as the international community, as the United States is talking to the Iranians, to the Omanis, to the Saudis, talking to domestic Yemeni parties should be an essential part of this process, because, as I said, there are many layers to the Yemen conflict. And so, unfortunately, we are now in a situation with, as Christian said, we don't see, the guns are not silent, and even Saudi Arabia that at some point declared a ceasefire, and actually, as I told you, over the last 2 days has intensified its military operations.
Thanks. So Jane, would you like to come in on the GCC angle and Oman's role in particular?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think Oman has been a very important facilitator, providing a channel to Houthis who've been able to be present in Muscat for talks with Saudi Arabia, which have gone on and off for some time, and also took place in Kuwait before. I think it is conceivable that Saudi Arabia and the Houthis at some point could reach an accommodation, because they each need something from each other. Saudi Arabia needs a quiet border. It hasn't been able to reach deterrence militarily. At the same time, the Houthis need money. They need some economic development for this incredibly poor country. Iran doesn't seem to have the resources or the willingness to provide that role, which traditionally has come from the GCC. So you could see how a deal might potentially work. But the history of Yemen is that it's a very fragmented state. It's not easy for any one party to govern. And Saleh did it, through all sorts of alliances with tribes and other networks. So returning to that need for intra-Yemeni dialogue, even if the Houthis win militarily, I cannot see them being able to centralize their authority across this country. I could only see there being some kind of power-sharing government in the future.
Many thanks. That's perfect also in timing terms, because we've now got 5 minutes. And so I'm going to consolidate a rather massive and massively important issue of transformations within the Gulf states into a single question, and invite each of you in 1.5 minutes to tackle one dimension. So we've got, the sort of big framework here is, besides all the foreign policy issues and threats and challenges, one of the biggest issues facing the GCC group is the financial horizon of running out of surplus capital, for all sorts of reasons to do with climate change and the impact on energy markets, the rise of renewables, more efficient storage solutions in major energy importer countries, So the bottom line is it's a question not so much of whether the GCC will start to run out of reserves, including saved assets estimated at about $2 trillion, but rather of when. Are we looking at 2034, 2040, when the sort of, the Gulf stops really generating enough surplus capital to spend on all the things it's now spending on? So the real core question is, what are the political repercussions, do you think, of any reforms, whether these are business reforms of the type we're seeing in the UAE and in Saudi Arabia, other kinds of reforms such as the indigenization of labor forces, the increasing reliance on nationals instead of migrant workers of all grades and professions and so on, youth unemployment on the one side, bringing people into the labor market and into the labor force, but also in a wider range of jobs maybe than nationals were used to working in. And ultimately, all these shifts will presumably produce one kind or another of political response, whether in opposition or a demand for representation and a voice. So if each of you were to pick up on sort of one of these angles, what will you leave us with in now a minute each? Jane, I'm going to come to you first.
I think that the countries are stepping up repression because they fear that austerity and worse living standards will precisely result in more opposition and demands for voice, but also that is massively going to hinder the development of any kind of knowledge economy, because people are having to self-censor so heavily and shut down large parts of their minds just to keep themselves safe.
Muted. Christian.
Okay, thank you. Yes. It's interesting that we are seeing moves both in Saudi and UAE to monetize their oil, to actually increase production now while it still has value. And I think this is what the leaders are hoping they can do. They can transfer the assets into investment income, get this stuff out of the ground while it still has a value to them. And at some point they can try and deal with that transition on their own terms. I think, as Jane has mentioned, the fact that we've had years of indications that actually political reform is not necessarily something that leaders in the Gulf want to entertain. So they've fallen back on security and on repression, but something's going to have to give. And of course, the elephant in the room is also climate change. And some of the models that predict that even by the 2040s and the 2050s, conditions are going to be so difficult that will become the number one flashpoint, I think, going forward. And so some of the long-range economic development plans are great to have on paper, but if they don't also look at the wider context, then really I think it's going to be a missed opportunity.
Another major challenge. Yasmin.
So very briefly, because I think I have 1 minute left, is I think what's going to happen politically really depends on the capacity of redistribution of whatever is left of those resources. First, among the regime and the centers of powers that are capable, as Jane hinted, of controlling society and controlling society's reaction to those declining resources. And second, to society as at large, giving them a minimum, even if it's less. Another issue is the degree of legitimacy of those rulers, because I could see someone like King Abdullah being able to pull off this. He was someone who has paid the society a lot when was needed, when he had the resources, but he had the kind of legitimacy that would have allowed him to actually even adopt limited austere measures without being that scared or that worried about the instability. So when this happens, the capital of legitimacy of the rulers will make a difference. And I think that before asking for a change in the regime or a change in the system, people will ask for provision, the what they need for. The issue in Gulf countries doesn't immediately become political. It's first socioeconomic, and then it becomes politicized, and this might take time.
Well, thanks, Yasmin, and thanks to all three of you for an excellent panel. I wish we'd had the time to again, discuss a lot more than this. I feel we've woven in a fair number of the questions we've had from the audience into your discussion. There's a couple more, for instance, on Turkey and where Turkey fits in all this, that I'm hoping will be tackled in our next panel, which is coming up in 30 minutes, on regional rivalry in Lebanon. So I invite everyone who's been following this discussion to join in another half an hour as well. But again, thank you, Yasmin, Jane, and Christian, for these amazing contributions, and I hope that everyone out there will continue following the final panels of our annual conference.